Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now, before we begin, I would like both current and potentially new members to know that the monthly giveaway for April 2023 will be the PlayStation 5 Collector Edition of Sandland. This is done in honor of the recently departed Akira Toriyama, and this will be given out to a lucky subscriber at the end of the month. Now, unless the man has some sort of secret unreleased project, this will be the last game to officially have his artwork. So with that, you can only imagine how valuable this will be going forward. For anyone that's interested in participating, just stay tuned to the very end of the video. Now, on to the topic of the day. Does anyone remember arcade gaming? You know, back before home systems had internet connections? Basically, the yesteryear of gaming. Back then, going to the arcade or the pizza parlor that had arcade games was a weekend affair or an after-school norm. People would gather around and play games, letting the machines eat up their quarters. See, back then, social gaming actually meant socializing in real time, with real people, in real places. Not connecting with faceless people from God knows where, doing God knows what. Don't get me wrong, the current age of gaming has brought some wonderful ideas and innovations, but I would be remiss if I didn't speak on some of the aspects that were left behind. Arcade gaming was an event in itself back in the day. The sounds of dozens of different gaming machines, mixed with discussions, laughter, and sometimes competitive gamers yelling at one another, is something that as an older gamer, I've actually come to miss dearly. So with this topic, let's humor ourselves. Suppose you had the chance to revive the arcade experience in your own home. What games would you use to make your own personal home arcade? Now, for the sake of both provoking critical thought and average space in most homes, let's say we can only have 15 arcade cabinets. It's worth noting that we'll only be using games that had official arcade cabinets. None of those makeshift ones that were around during the final years of the arcade. First up, we need to give some love to the arcade pioneers. These are the games that your parents and your grandparents would have known about. Had it not been for the influence of these games, who can say what gaming would be today? The games I choose to start with are Pac-Man, Centipede, and Dragon's Lair. Pac-Man is not only a staple of Namco Bandai's company, but gaming as a whole. In general terms, Pac-Man is seen as gaming's first official mascot. This is definitely one of those games that are a must for any home arcade to be taken seriously. It's hard to say that any home arcade should be taken seriously if they don't have a Pac-Man arcade cabinet in there somewhere. The second pioneer game that I will have in my arcade is Centipede. Now when it comes to classic shunt games, there are actually plenty to choose from. The genre dominated the arcades in the early days of arcade gaming. But what made Centipede stand out was the fact that you had barriers that protected you, and you also had to shoot through that could actually kill the enemies. And the more notable aspect of the game was the trackball controller. Not many games of that era actually used it, but there is actually one that did that we'll be talking about a little bit later on. The last pioneer game that I will add to my arcade is Dragon's Lair. This game was literally you playing through QTE events through a cartoon. It was based on Hanna-Barbera's animation of the same name. Gamers enjoyed playing through Don Bluth's cartoon of Dirk the Daring saving Princess Daphne. The main draw for this game was the unique nature of playing through a cartoon as a video game. Okay, for my next three, I'm going with the old school beat 'em up genre. They were normally the ones that were able to let people play with multiple players at once. In a way, you can call these the party games before the term party game was ever a thing. Now, the three games that I chose here are X-Men, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Alien vs Predator. The choice of the X-Men arcade machine from Konami was pretty easy. Not only was this a pretty good game back in the day, but it also did something not many arcade games did before or after. And that was the ability to have 6 people playing at one time. Normally, the standard was 2, sometimes 4, but very rarely was it 6. You could have truly considered this game a party game based off that fact alone. And as a comic fan, it was personally a pleasure for me to face off against the X-Men's polar opposite at that time, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. My second choice, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, was an easy one. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was pretty much riding high. Video games, toys, and apparel sales for the franchise were at all-time highs for the metrics of that era. And the TMNT arcade machine, that definitely capitalized on the hype, complete with a great soundtrack and gameplay. This was a 4-player cabinet for obvious reasons. My third beat-em-up choice is one that never made it to actually having a home game system port. That is probably one of the best beat-em-up games ever made. Alien vs Predator is a true gem. The game allowed you to choose between 4 characters, 2 Space Marines and 2 Predators. They team up to fight the alien threat. Now oddly enough, I've only ever seen a 3-player cabinet for this one, even though it's very clear that this one should have had 4 players. Now, for my next 3 arcade games, I'll be going with the fighting game genre. Now towards the end of the arcade era, this genre was the one that took up the most space in any given arcade. Now for me personally, the 3 fighting games that I would choose here are Super Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat 3, and Virtua Fighter 2. For my first choice, no home arcade would be complete without a version of Street Fighter in there of some sort. Super Street Fighter 2 is my choice out of all the Street Fighter 2 versions because of the points of the new warriors. It's also when the series started to have a combo counter, which became common for the franchise thereafter. Street Fighter itself is a staple of the genre. My second pick, Mortal Kombat 3, was chosen for being near and dear to me. Mortal Kombat itself was considered the premier mature fighting game franchise back in its day, complete with blood, brutalities, fatalities, and the like. Also, much like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat was also considered a genre staple. Mortal Kombat 3 in particular was also when the franchise began to experiment with legitimate combo functions and the dash feature. The final fighting game I chose was Virtua Fighter 2. Now this game was the epitome of arcade fighting. Fluid controls with colorful characters and even more colorful backdrops. I actually chose this over Tekken 2 because personally, I found it to be a bit more user-friendly compared to Tekken. Now the game story was admittedly very weak, but then again, when it comes to most of these arcade games, the last thing that anyone really thinks about is story or lore. Next up, we have the driving games. No true arcade can get away with being an arcade without having at least one of these. Now for me personally, there were 2 that really stand out. So for my own personal arcade, I would choose Daytona USA and Crazy Taxi. Daytona USA was a great game back in the yesteryear of the arcades. The game really just licensed the Daytona name. There wasn't any relation to Daytona beyond that. The controls were loose and the game was fast. The color palette was extremely bright, but what really made this game shine was the excellent soundtrack. My second choice, Crazy Taxi, was probably one of the most unique driving games out there. It was the first game where you were playing as a taxi driver while trying to bring people from point A to point B within a time limit. Another thing that made this game stand out was the unique licenses involved. Levi's, Pizza Hut, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and a host of others allowed their likeness to be featured in this game, which in turn added to the enjoyment of the overall package. Now, for my final 4 games, it was actually pretty hard to categorize these for various reasons. They each have their own importance in arcade nostalgia, I chose G.I. Joe, Time Crisis, Outrigger, and Run and Gun for my final 4 games. G.I. Joe was a run and gun game based on the popular 80s cartoon of the same name. You were able to choose between Duke, Roadblock, Scarlet, and of course the fan favorite, Snake Eyes, as you fought against the evil organization known as Cobra. The real draw for this one was that it could be played with 4 players at once, and anyone that was a fan of the cartoon series back in its heyday found a whole mess of enjoyment with this one. The second of my final 4 games is Outrigger. Outrigger is the second trackball game on this list. The game was both in the arcade and later ported over to Sega Dreamcast. This was a true arcade gem, a fast-paced shooter with a unique controller. Not only was there a trackball for movement, but instead of having conventional buttons like most arcade games did, the game functioned with a trigger joystick. If you ever wanted something that was a little bit different in your arcade games, this is the one that you would gravitate to. For the third game in my final 4, I went with light guns. Now, light guns were somewhat popular in the arcades, and one of the more popular ones was Time Crisis. Namco's light gun shooter was one of the premier gun games back in its day, and one of the cooler aspects of the game was that it had a cover system, activated by a pedal that you actually stepped on. Now I know there were games like Sega's Virtual Cop and Konami's Silent Scope, not to mention Midway's Area 51 that was out there, but personally, I feel Time Crisis was top of the mountain with this one. Lastly, for my final game, this is one for the sports fans. Normally, most people would have been with games like NBA Jam or NFL Blitz. But for me, I chose Konami's basketball game, Run and Gun. This was a vertical view basketball arcade simulator. The game was a great 4-player simulator game. Now, albeit, the characters did look a little exaggerated. But with that said, this game had great balance between simulating classic NBA action and loose controls of the arcade. Those were the 15 arcade machines I'd have on my list to recreate my own arcade. Now I tried to put together an arcade package that would be able to cater to everyone, from the boomer to the millennial to the Gen Zer. Now if you could create your own arcade, what games would you use? Let us know in the comments. Hey everyone, thanks for taking the time to stay until the end of the video. I just want to take a moment to let everyone know about our weekly and monthly giveaways. We give PSN or Amazon cards to a random member every Saturday. And at the end of the month, we give out a full-blown physical game. Now, to have a shot at winning the goods, all anyone has to do is subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Twitch channel, or our website and leave a comment. To be fair, it's probably good that you join up to all 3, just to give you a better chance. Now there are times that we actually give PayPal money instead, in case we can't find a card or a game for whatever reason that the winner hails from. Now, if anyone has any questions, feel free to leave a comment or see the details at the website. Thanks everyone, and I hope you all have a great day.